Georgia has passed a controversial reform despite weeks of, at times, violent protests. We spoke to Professor of Government Natasha Lindstaedt about what the law does.
Well, the law states that any organization, and this could be an NGO or a media organization that receives more than 20% of their funds from abroad, has to be labeled a foreign agent. Of course, this has really negative connotations in the post-Soviet countries like Georgia. And so that's not something that they would want. And also it basically means that they're going to have to follow very stringent rules. In some cases, it could be very arbitrary, administrative liability if they don't fill out the right form, if they don't detail what they're spending, and there could be random inspections that could happen. And if they don't follow along, then they could face up to a fine of maybe around $9,000. And this forces NGOs to play a game of cat and mouse where they're focused on trying to deal with all these arbitrary laws rather than trying to support democracy and transparency.
What has been the motivation of the government to bring these laws into effect?
So we're seeing that a lot of countries that are autocratizing, particularly those in Russia's neighborhood, have used this so-called Russia law, which goes after NGOs, and Russia used it itself, most notably in 2012, after there were protests following a fraudulent election. And Vladimir Putin blamed it on NGOs. He felt that these Western-supported NGOs were the problem, that they're threatening the stability of autocratic regimes or leaders and so forth. And so we see a copycat laws. You saw it happen in Hungary in 2017, in Kyrgyzstan more recently. So in Georgia's case, they tried to pass this law about a year ago, but there were huge protests that broke out. But the Georgia Dream Party, who is in charge at the moment, sees NGOs supported by the West as a huge threat to their own stability, and that's why they wanted to implement this law.
Yeah. Is it that they are wanting to move closer to Russia? I mean, the US has poured billions of dollars into Georgia. Do they want to move closer to Russia, or are they just nervous because of what's happened in Ukraine?
So that's really hard to tell what the actual leadership wants. The de facto leader is Bidzina Ivanishvili, who's a billionaire. He is either has coinciding interests with Russia, or he's afraid of Russia, or he's threatened by Russia. But whatever the case, the Georgia Dream leadership is deciding to side with Russia on this one. They want to be closer to Russia now. Outwardly, they claim because they don't want to be invaded by the Russians, as Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. But the public is not in agreement with this at all. In fact, recent polling revealed that 80% of the Georgian public wants to be closer to Europe, wants to be an EU candidate country. And that's actually why the protests have been so strong recently. It's not necessarily about the law itself, but about the implications of the law, that this means that this is going to end their dreams of being an EU candidate country.
Yeah. And do you think that is going to happen? The US has started to threaten, not threaten, but just warn them, you know, that the ongoing support might not be there if they draw closer to Russia.
I think that's what the big issue is for much of the Georgian public, that's what the response will be, because it will be difficult to continue to support a country where NGOs really can't operate. And we've seen where these NGO laws have been passed. These NGOs have to leave. They can't really work there. And that makes it more difficult for Europe and for the US to continue to offer support for the incumbent regime that is clearly moving towards Russia and that doesn't really want Western support anyways.
Yeah. And so their dreams of becoming part of the EU, do you think this really would bring this to a very quick halt?
It definitely does, simply because Georgia is moving more towards an authoritarian regime. It's at best really just a competitive authoritarian regime, meaning it holds elections, but the playing field is tilted so heavily in favor of the ruling party. Opposition politicians report that they are already being surveilled, that there's surveillance on them. This is going to really cripple free speech, make it more difficult for the media to operate, make it more difficult to uncover corruption. And that's one of the key requisites for being part of the European Union, that you satisfy some of this Copenhagen criteria, that you are a democracy, even as we see Hungary falling apart in that regards. But it's going to make it very, very difficult for Georgia to be a candidate country.
Yeah. Do you think these protests are going to continue?
I think it is likely that they're going to continue. Georgia has a history of protests, a history of political activity, of people taking risks, of going to the streets. It's a very politically vibrant country that has had enough, and there are a lot of grievances. There's very high levels of poverty at the moment, very high levels of unemployment. So there's a lot going on at the moment at the same time that would be sort of like the perfect storm. Bringing people to the streets who are incredibly fed up of what's going on. And I could see that these protests could go on for some time.
Yeah. Good to get your thoughts on this. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.